Well, thank you, John, and everyone for attending. John, for inviting me to give this talk, and everyone else for coming to let me share my work with you. As Sid said, he thought tiltmeters had died. So I'm hopefully going to show you that they're not completely dead yet, and they might give us some interesting possibilities in terms of hydraulic fracture monitoring, etc. So tiltmeters, I've used this picture before. Many of you have possibly seen it, but this is, I think, a picture from Fisher et al., who actually kind of give a good graphic of the idea behind tiltmeters. So you can have surface-mounted tilts, tilt in a downhole offset well, or tilt in downhole tiltmeters. And as the fracture opens, the rock deforms, and these deformations change the inclination. And the idea is that hopefully you can glean from that where the fracture is and information about the fracture geometry. Something that's kind of new is there are also fiber optic strain measurements, which could also be added to tiltmeter measurements. So that's something a little bit new, and they sort of fit in the same paradigm. They're measuring different things, though. So just to show you why I think tiltmeters haven't been particularly successful in terms of monitoring hydraulic fractures. I mean, this is a calculation that would go back, the same sort of calculation Gauss did for electricity, but essentially if you've got a hydraulic fracture here and it's a distance r minus rho from, say, a point in the fracture to an observation point, then if you refer things to the center of the fracture, and rho minus r naught is the distance from a typical point in the fracture to the center of the fracture, and r minus r naught is the observation point to the fracture, then, just simple algebra shows that you can decompose this, and r minus r naught, if you're far away from the fracture, is much bigger than the distance between any point in the fracture and the center of the fracture. Okay, so what happens is any field variable, like say the tiltmeter measurement, can be expanded in terms of essentially a Taylor series, and eventually you can show that you get essentially the tiltmeter, or the strain gradient, the displacement gradient measurement based at the center of the fracture with the first moment. The first moment would be the volume of the fracture. And then the higher order moments, these decay much more rapidly than the first order moment. So if you're far away, then basically the information that's contained in the tiltmeter measurements, these are so significantly subdominant to this. So essentially what you're seeing in the tiltmeters is essentially the fracture volume, and you've got some information about the first moments. So essentially and one of the big problems about tiltmeters is you can't really distinguish between a very sort of flat fracture, something like this, a dislocation that's long, that's extensive but very thin, or a box like this that's very fat but has the same volume. You can't distinguish between the two. But one big advantage of tiltmeters is it gives you very good volume information. So anyway, that's one of the reasons why tiltmeters haven't reached I mean, haven't been explored much in industry. So I'm going to talk about a Kalman filter, and this is a sort of probabilistic approach. So we're all familiar with, you know, the normal distribution, and it's based on Gaussians, the normal distribution curve, these exponentials. So if you've got a one event x naught and another event x1 with probabilities, you know, p, the blue and the red probabilities, which are exponentials, the sort of combined event, I mean, to determine the probability of the combined event, you multiply these two together. I don't know, should I move this out the way? I don't know. Does this impede the, I don't know. Anyway, the combined probability is also an exponential where x hat is the mean, okay, and sigma is the standard deviation. So those look like, I mean, basically a weighted average of the sort of constituent means and weighted by the standard deviations, which you can write in this sort of update form, x1 minus x naught with this gain function, if you like. So, and where the gain function is based on the probabilities, these weights, and the standard deviation for the combined mean looks like this, and it also has a similar sort of recursion to it. Okay, so the interesting thing about this is, I mean, the Kalman filter is basically based on Gaussians, and based on the fact that when you take the combined probability of two Gaussians, you get another Gaussian. Okay, so how does that fit with tiltmeter measurements? Well, so move this down here. There we go. So if you've got, say, a fracture that's open, and this is what classically has been done with tiltmeters. You've got a fracture with an opening xk, and the tiltmeter measurement h is essentially the remote strains. This would be the tilt that you measure, and it's got some noise. And essentially you do a least squares fit, and that's one instant of the hydraulic fracture. And you throw that information away, and then you do another measurement, and so you carry on, and ignoring the fact that between one measurement and the next, they linked essentially by a dynamic model, which the two successive measurements are coupled by the dynamics of the hydraulic fracture. So that's where the Kalman filter comes in, because basically you can, instead of doing least squares fitting, you can do this filtering. Okay, so here's you've moved from the red TK, that times measurement at time step TK, to TK plus 1, and you get this dynamical system. So this would be a hydraulic fracture simulator or dynamic model, and tilt measurements, and this is this update. And you can see, you remember I had x naught and then x1 minus x naught w. So it's got the same format, and it's not by happenstance, it's because of this Gaussian nature. I mean, so I sort of loosely motivated this form. So this is a sort of predictor and corrector process. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about modeling the dynamics. So essentially you're able to couple through a dynamic model the two sets of measurements. So this is connecting the dots, if you like. I mean, which makes the problem much better posed. It's not ill posed. You don't have that ambiguity about what the shape of the fracture is, and So anyway, now I'm going to talk about the ILSA scheme, and I'll just run through this with you. John already mentioned it in the introduction. So this is a fully coupled, fluid flow and elasticity matrix for a planar fracture. And everything we've discovered, and this is work with, that Emmanuel de Tonnay has championed, and many other authors, many people are familiar with this. Basically, as you move your observation point within the fracture to the tip, these equations reduce to these equations. So, and a whole multi-scale asymptotics comes out. Closest to the tip, you've got the toughness asymptote, leak-off asymptote, and viscous asymptote. And these are the time scales, and this would be for a radial fracture. But these asymptotes apply no matter whether it's radial or not. These timescales are based on a radial fracture. But these asymptotes are based on, it doesn't matter whether it's radial or not. As long as the curve is smooth, these asymptotic behaviors apply. So when you're actually trying to propagate a hydraulic fracture, you get a complete mixture of all these all these different asymptotes in this toughness, leak-off, and viscosity phase space. Okay, so that's the dynamic model of ILSA. Just a brief idea about how ILSA works. If you've got a trial width, you can say we just use the toughness asymptote. We can find where the fracture front is trivially, and now we know, because we've got that square root asymptote, we know what the volume in the tip is. So that's known, and now the unknown in the equations becomes the pressure at the tip. So this is just a brief sort of little video of how the ILSA scheme works. Basically, it updates the volume in the tip. It calculates it needs a new element. It calculates and keeps updating the asymptote until finally. So you can see, even with very few elements, you get a very, and piecewise constant elements, you get a pretty accurate model of the fracture aperture. Okay, so in a planar context, it looks like this. So that same calculation, you have survey points and you determine where the fracture footprint is. And here's just a model of an experiment that Andy Bunger did of a fracture going through a stress jump, a symmetric fracture. And I'll just do that again. The black line is the ILSA model, and the gray lines are the hydraulic, are the experiments. So you can see they match pretty well. I mean, here's just to show you, you can get all this multi-scale behavior at the tip. These little blocks here are the survey points, and they're colored with the multi-scale behavior active. Here you can see there's a whole lot of toughness going on. The fracture's not advancing much. And here there's much more viscous behavior. Here you can see there's a lot more leak off here and toughness behavior there. So it's very complex, but it's easily treated by this. Okay. So here I've got hang on, I'm just going to have to get out of that. Here we're now applying the Kalman filter with an ILSA model, and if I can get the video to work. So the red line is the ILSA synthetic data, and then I used an ILSA model which had no idea about the fracture, the stress barriers. So I put, this is a typical P3D kind of geometry, symmetric stress jump and a pay zone. And the ILSA model assumes that the fracture, it's a completely isotropic material. There's no leak off, and the fracture is would otherwise go completely radially because it's an isotropic material. It doesn't know anything about this change in geometry. So based on the tiltmeters, it's managed to capture that change in geometry. So the Kalman filter is able to capture significantly unmodeled dynamics, what I call unmodeled dynamics. And here's another example of the hydraulic fracture. You know, the red line, this is a stress drop. So you get this sort of inverted shell shape, and the EKF ILSA scheme comes up with a blue outline. So it's a pretty good capture. It's not able to capture much of this. You see there's a slight inflection point, but it's not able to capture the detailed geometry over there. So there's some history to this. So together with the CSRO, I partnered with them, and we tested out this ILSA-EKF model in mines in Australia. And I mean, here's an experiment. There's a paper that you can look up on my website. So here there's some sort of boreholes, and you're looking at pumping from AA, and these were monitoring wells, boreholes. And what we were looking at was trying to see what the fracture geometry was based on these tiltmeters that were located at these magenta points on the surface. So there's quite a significant array of tiltmeters, and there's a monitoring well here and a monitoring well here, and they're pumping over here. So this is a sort of time elapse plot. So this is where the ILSA scheme said the fracture went. So this is the ultimate geometry. But the monitoring well captured the fracture 26 minutes, whereas the ILSA scheme said it would arrive at 31 minutes. So it's not totally, I mean, there are lots of vagaries underground. But one thing that was significant was that the hydraulic fracture didn't actually, the ILSA scheme, actually, let me get back to this pointer. The ILSA scheme said that the hydraulic fracture wouldn't get to this point, and it didn't. So that was kind of interesting and significant. So that's from a field experiment, if you like. The issue with this ILSA-EKF model is that it's time consuming, because ILSA has many degrees of freedom. So it takes an enormous amount of time. I mean, several hours to do the post-processing of the tiltmeter data. So a posteriori, you could actually tell where get this analysis. But given the sort of imponderables and the unknowns in the whole setup, the question is, is a full ILSA model required? I mean, can't we get away with a much simpler model? And so that was where I sort of looked at implementing this model that Yegor Donsoff and Andy Bunger and many other and numerous others introduced. This reduced, it's a 5-degree of freedom model. Basically, you have these the primary variables are these distances to the fracture boundary. You assume an elliptic footprint, and this is from the injection point. Okay, and you take these averages, and that gives you the semi-axes AX and A1. Okay, and assuming a constant pressure, you know what the fracture opening is going to be, and you can write that down in terms of an elliptic function and get the volume. For fracture propagation, it's even possible to put in some multi-scale behavior, like with the ILSA scheme. So now it's very crude, because you're just looking at how you're going to propagate each of those legs of the ellipse, each of the legs of this ellipse. But it's possible to come up with an approximate from the asymptotics, an approximate adjustment for the toughness based on the viscosity. So this is a correction to the toughness that you would require based on the viscosity. So basically you minimize the fracture propagates by minimizing this energy functional, and these are the viscous updates to the fracture toughness. Okay, so that's the basis of the model, and I looked at, now this is the EKF-R model, if you like. I looked at a number of different tilt configurations, 5 tiltmeters, 9 tiltmeters, 5 in a row, 5 in what's called a Sobel sequence. So these are sort of quasi-random sequences from statistical sampling, and also an L-shaped, 5 tiltmeters in an L-shaped fracture. So I'm just looking at different tilt configurations, and these the black dot is where you actually placing injecting fluid. Okay, so a 3x3 array, 200 meters distant. So this is a picture. So there's the array on the back, and 200 meters away, this is where the fracture came out. Now, on the left here, I'm plotting the fracture lengths, and on the right here, I plot the fracture volume. So even though the injected volume was this, and this reduced model has no knowledge of any leak off. There's no leak off in the model. The tiltmeters, as I said, tiltmeters are very good at capturing fracture volume. So it matches the fracture volume really, really well. You can see I've put sort of 5%, 10% noise in these tiltmeter measurements. Okay, so I mean, that does a fairly good job of capturing the geometry. I mean, obviously the ellipse is sort of not quite matching the P3D kind of geometry, but still. If you have a straight line tiltmeter configuration, you end up with something like this. I'm just going to cycle through the Sobel sequence. This is 500 meters distance, so it's even more remote. The Sobel sequence does a really, really good job. So this shows you that there is a potential for optimization of the location of the fractures, I mean, of the tiltmeters, if that's a possibility, I mean, just pragmatically. An L-shaped tiltmeter, I mean, just looking at different configurations. I know these, it's sort of upside down, but this is the easiest way I could sort of plot these. But we are getting a pretty good measure of the fracture length. The height is a little bit wobbly. I mean, it overestimates the height, obviously. But the volume it captures pretty well. I mean, just more of the same. Different geometries here. I've got the fracture going a little bit asymmetrically. And yeah, I've got a sort of stress drop configuration. Same story. I mean, the tiltmeters do a pretty good job of updating this elliptic approximation to capture a close approximation to where the fracture, estimate of where the fracture is. So, I mean, these are just different tilt configurations. So the L-shaped array is not so good there. Okay, I think that's... So one of the things when you have surface tilts, you're not sure of the orientation of the fracture. So I looked at a scheme where you would actually, after one predictor corrector Kalman filter step, you would actually optimize the error in the tilt vectors, or you'd minimize that error in the tilt vectors. And anyway, that was the scheme I looked at, and here's a sort of plot of this blue line is that error vector, And those are the tilt vectors plotted. So I'm going to escape from here, and I'm going to, so let me show you. So the tiltmeter, I mean, the fracture plane was assumed to be horizontal. The red one is always the synthetic, the actual fracture plane, I mean, coming from the synthetic model. Okay, so you can see after one step it's got this. So you can look here at the change in the tiltmeter tilt vectors. It's optimized them. Okay, one step, two steps, and so on, and then it's slowly adjusting them as time goes on, and until it sort of gets to a point where I've said, okay, I think this is good enough, and then it continues. Okay, so the configuration here was with these surface tiltmeters. So surface tiltmeters. So this is after 25 minutes, 50 minutes, 75 minutes, and 100 minutes. So it does a fairly good job of capturing the fracture geometry. I mean, it can't capture all these bells, these twists, I mean, because it's constrained to an ellipse, but it kind of fits the ellipse to as best as possible to the fracture footprint. And the question is, okay, so this is a time elapsed sequence. This is still the 25-minute, 50, 75, and 100, just to show you how big they are in real life. Okay, and this is running the full simulation. Basically, you can see the tilt vectors are matched, and you'll see that ultimately these. I mean, I'm just basically showing you a movie. This was the search process until I stopped the search, and now it's no longer searching. It's just taken the dip and strike. So the dip was 20 degrees and the strike was 15, and it came up with 20.82 and 14.2 as the optimal. Again, it matches the fracture volume. There's the injected volume. This is the fracture volume. It matches the fracture volume pretty well. And this is a plot of the fracture footprint, looking down that red arrow, if you like. Yeah, so yeah, I'll just let it run. I mean, actually, I don't know. Let's just wait for it to reach the end, and then we'll comment. Yeah, so it is possible, therefore, to actually have a process whereby you don't know what the orientation of the fracture is, and get the tiltmeter Kalman filter model to actually find the fracture orientation and then lock it in and get the fracture footprints. So it's not, I mean, this is essentially the same data up to 100 minutes. It's not perfect, but it's not that bad. You know, yeah. And I mean, you can see there is a slight mismatch between the fracture plane, the red fracture plane, and the other one. Okay, so I don't know if that's got to the full 90. Anyway, okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So this is it. I mean, this is what the reduced model provides. So for a hydraulic fracture that's going to take 100 minutes has a life injection time of 100 minutes. Okay, in the simulation, the CPU time was 21 seconds, 21, 18, 21. And then for the asymmetric stress jump with depletion and surface tilts, where it actually had to find the fracture orientation. It took 77 seconds. But all of that is, on a scale of 100 minutes, is still fast enough for the possibility of real-time inversion. I know you'd have to do a fair bit of work to sort of capture the to capture the data and process it. But I mean, with a 5 degree of freedom model, it's not that onerous. Okay, and I mean, I'm pretty much, I sort of, I don't know if I went too quickly, but I didn't want to have too much to talk about. So, I mean, tilt measurements, I discussed tilt measurements and the I think I showed you what the information content is in those remote tilts. Typically, least squares is used for those tiltmeter measurements. And I showed you that by connecting the dots, the Kalman filter enables you to actually get a lot more milk a lot more out of that information and get rid of the non-uniqueness, because you are saying, well, each tilt measurement is not isolated. It comes from the fractures move from one time step to the next. So it was in a particular place and it's moved to a different place, right? So, and through the dynamic model, we get a lot of information. Or we can make use of the tiltmeter information a lot more. So I introduced the ILSA-EKF scheme, which is slow in the sense that, I mean, it's modeling a lot more. And then the 5 degree of the Donsoff et al. 5 degree of freedom model combined with the EKF, which is really, really fast, right? It's, I mean, and I think that's quite impressive that it, for the remote tiltmeter measurements, it actually captures the geometry pretty well. I mean, given the vagaries of what we know underground, I mean, it's probably, it doesn't warrant much more than that. So, and we can also use the EKF-R with this single time step optimization to determine the fracture orientation. But it does cost more to do that. And this is something that is quite interesting. The EKF compensates for unmodeled dynamics. So even though you're not modeling significant physical processes such as leak-off. So the EKF-R model had no leak-off in it, but the tiltmeters provided information to the model that captured that leak-off. And the geometry was appropriately captured. And even the stress homogeneity. So it's going to give you the sort of maximum likelihood fit for the dynamics of your model, and it is able to capture physical processes not included in the modeling. So because the modeling was only based on the viscous toughness asymptote and had nothing to do with it, didn't know about leak-off. Different tiltmeter configurations, 3x3 linear, 5x1, 5 L-shaped, and 5 Sobol arrays. They have different performance. I mean, the 3x3 is actually a pretty good performer, but if tiltmeters are limited and I mean, say they were really expensive and you limited in the number you can deploy, but you can deploy them anywhere, like surface tilts, then a Sobol array might be better. And because the EKF-R is efficient, you could actually, I mean, do some analysis of the situation before you actually put in tiltmeters to see how to optimize the tiltmeter locations. It's so quick. So the CPU inversion times are about 20 seconds on 100 minutes of injection, or 70 seconds when you don't know the orientation. So there's distinct potential for real-time inversion and possibly even control. I mean, you know, if you see the fractures not going where you don't want it to go, then maybe you should back off or do something different in terms of the injection schedule. Anyway, I think I'm pretty much done with what I wanted to say, and I'm happy to take questions.
Outstanding, Anthony. Thank you. I mean, there are a couple of questions, and seeing as we have a fair bit of time, I'm going to just suggest that these people unmic and ask the question directly. And so I'm going to start with Alexei Savitsky. I might have caught him by surprise.
Oh, okay.
But
Yeah, we need
Alexei,
to.
oh,
Can you hear me?
yes.
Yeah, I can repeat the question here. So the question is, when you're, Anthony, when you're looking at this series representation of fracture, and the first term is volume, it's momentum, which represents the volume of the fracture. What happens with the leak off? So when you're looking from far away, do you see volume change in a rock volume, which contains fracture? Or you're just looking at the volume in the fracture? Because I would think that's whatever you injected there and it's leaks, if it's limited, you wouldn't be able to differentiate.
You're talking about this slide. Is this the one you were talking about?
Well, slide was more your mathematical representation of observations as a series.
Oh, okay. So you mean this one?
Yes.
This one. Yeah.
No,
So this model, the model that I used, had no leak off, but the synthetic data had leak off. Okay, so it's because it goes back to this issue here. Basically, the tiltmeter data captures the first moment, which is the volume of the fracture, really well. Okay, the higher order moments are which affect the, you know, where the fracture, any asymmetry in the fracture, that decays a lot more rapidly, because these are taking derivatives of a power law that's a negative power law, so they're going to decay more rapidly. So most of the information content is in this M0, so that's why it captures leak off, even though I didn't put it explicitly in the model.
Well, we were on that slide.
This one.
No, the one before. The one with different geometries, flat fracture element.
This one.
This one.
Yeah.
That's the question. So let's say you have no fracture. You just distribute fluid. Imagine that you have no actual opening of the fracture.
Yes.
But you will have a distribution of injected fluid within that same element. No fracture opening, but still deformation in the rock because we injected. So we have extension.
So you mean it's in a porous medium kind of?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's
and then, but it's limited. So it's a hypothetical experiment. So it's exactly the same shape, but now instead of opening mechanically the fracture, we just dilate formation pore space because we injected fluid. Would it look similar or different?
I think it would. It wouldn't be able to distinguish. It would probably give you the volume of that.
Okay.
I don't nucleus of strain or whatever it is, right? You know the.
Okay. Exactly. So that's the essence of my question. So now let's combine it. So let's say we have an actual open fracture, and then in case of low leak off, you have a quite contained zone of dilation around this fracture.
Yeah.
And when we interpret fracture volume, actually we would be interpreting the volume of fracture plus dilated zone.
I see what you mean now. Yeah. So okay, so you've highlighted us, and that's great. I mean, this is good to question. You've highlighted a sort of shortcoming of the experiment that I did, because I used, I didn't have a poroelastic model. I just used, ILSA, which is a planar fracture. It has leak off, but I'm not modeling the back stress and all that stuff, the deformation. You know what I mean? It's just Carter leak off. So yes, so there is going to be some strain embedded in the material, in the poroelastic medium, which would manifest itself in the volume. Yeah.
And it's
so in
it's
fact,
not
it would be very interesting if one had a poroelastic fracture, to see what would happen. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not so much as highlighting deficiency of the method. It's more open question about what would you expect to be reflected in tiltmeter data, and how it would change between low leak-off case where there's dilation zone is contained, very close to the fracture, versus high leak-off zone where it's quite distributed.
Exactly. I mean, my Carter leak-off things it's a very low leak-off zone. So but I do admit that's a deficiency in the experiment that I did. It would be very interesting to do simulated data where you actually have a high diffusive zone, right? So because that volume, it must feel the volume, it's poroelastic, right? I mean, it's deforming, it must affect the tiltmeters measurement.
John, can I ask a very quick follow-up question? So it's something
One
different.
question, Alexei.
There is probably a long curve. Very quick. When you have hydraulic fracture now with a propant, and if you wait long enough in a relatively porous environment, then pore pressure would diffuse, and then it shouldn't be reflected in tiltmeter data, except for the volume occupied by propant. Have you ever looked at cases with prop? Because now you have a good test for your own technique. We know exactly how much propant we pumped in, and if you wait long enough, fluid will dissipate, pore pressure will be gone, and your inversion should actually yield the volume of propant with assumption of propant porosity. Have you done it?
No. These, I mean, that's what I always find in research. They actually give you many more questions than when you started, right? Yeah, that's another very nice experiment.
Thank you, John. Thanks for giving me so much time.
Outstanding questions. And Yegor, I'm going to skip your question for a moment because Tom Doe's question is along the same lines. And Tom, I'm wondering if your question was answered.
Yeah, I as a kind of simple-minded person, I had very low expectations that I was going to be able to follow any of this talk. I was very pleasantly surprised that it made all very, very good sense. Thank you, Anthony. Very good talk. I just wanted to confirm something that I think I gathered in your summary side is essentially the difference between injected volume and fracture volume would be your leak off, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so that becomes a major constraint in the model. I am kind of interested, though, listening to Alex's questions, is if that would also be a guide towards thinking about this poroelasticity question, what's happening to the leak off in terms of the deformation field?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it would be very interesting if one had a poroelastic model and generated synthetic data and then use the reduced model to see what the EKF-R reduced model to see what does it capture, just the fracture volume, or how it treats that diffused volume. I don't know how. I can't imagine. I mean, that's still an open question. I can't hazard a guess, but these are really interesting questions. Yeah.
Well, I think it shows the value of these seminars that one can explore these things and
absolutely. Yeah.
So I'll skip back to Yegor. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, John, and thank you, Anthony. I mean, actually, first I have a comment related to Alexi's question about upper elasticity. I mean, I think it's excellent observation. I actually looked into this a little bit at some point for the case when kind of your diffusion zone is still sort of small, and so what happens is that at least I look at it in the context of stress shadow, not the actual deformation or tilt. But what happens is that the same amount of water in the fracture versus in poroelastic material, your at least stress signature essentially gets reduced by a certain number, like a multiplier, so that and it's roughly, I don't recall exactly, but maybe it depends on like a BO coefficient and so on, but roughly a 0.5, 0.3 sort of scale. And so essentially your kind of, my expectation at least is that you will still feel this poroelastic response, but it's going to be kind of lower magnitude a little bit. So that was my comment. But my question is just kind of more clarification to Anthony. Again, it could be that I missed it, but if you can comment a little bit on how you generate the the initial tilt signals for this fast model. Did you use ILSA or
I used ILSA with Leakoff.
Okay.
Yeah. And toughness. So it was a full blow. I mean,
Sure.
Thank you for asking that question, because I didn't. I knew I had a lot to say, but I didn't. So I sort of zoomed through it. But yes, so what I did was I used ILSA, but with all the bells and whistles, Leakoff and toughness propagation, etc. So the ILSA-EKF model or EKF-ILSA model uses essentially the ILSA model with just viscous propagation. Okay. So it doesn't know about toughness. It's just using the viscous mode to propagate, right? But it captures the toughness, etc. And for the reduced model, it didn't have any Leakoff in it, whereas the ILSA model had Leakoff, toughness, and the full multi-scale asymptotics.
Thank you.
So that's what I generate, because I wanted to have a more complex sort of physical situation that I'm trying to capture and see what essentially, if they didn't get any tiltmeter information, both the ILSA model, ILSA-EKF, and the reduced model would just give you a radial fraction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and a little kind of follow up to that. I mean, if you can comment a little bit on what are the typical magnitudes of the tilt angles and about signal to noise ratio, how noise would affect the result. I mean, did you run sensitivity to the different noise levels?
Yeah, I mean, you saw I went up to 10% noise. So that's quite significant, I guess. So what I did was I took the maximum tilt over the whole, over the whole duration, and then I multiplied that by 10% and put in white noise, right? Okay. Yeah. So it's about 10%. I mean, in those, I don't know, in these things here, you can see in the signals, 10% noise here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So so what I do is I put the 10% noise in, right? And then, yeah.
But I mean, did you try to put 100%, 1,000%? I mean,
oh no, I mean,
what sort of level at which it's gonna break down?
Oh yeah, it's gonna break down. Yeah.
But I mean,
it's not that robust. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, otherwise well, then you've got to adjust this parameter here to sort of put much. I mean, something I didn't talk about is scaling. You have to, when you implement Kalman filter, you have to really check the scaling of the and this goes back to your question, the scaling of the remote tilt measurements. They're really small. Okay, so you've got to, and you need to, I mean, there's this parameter here which controls how much emphasis it gives to the model compared to the tiltmeter measurements. And that's a tuning parameter, if you like, which if you make it too sensitive, then and the noise is high, it's just gonna chase after the noise and you'll get garbage. Yeah.
Okay. And actually we also see the magnitude, right? So it's about 10 to the minus 7 radians, right? This
yeah.
tilts. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I don't see any more. I don't see any more questions. I think the message here is that there are reliable methods for inversion of this data. The question is, why aren't we using it more? And that may relate to Yegor's last question on signal to noise ratio and the depth of measurements and stuff like that. And so if there's anyone in the audience that's familiar with this, yep, chime in. We got a couple of minutes.
I think we have another question in the chat, John.
Oh, did I miss it? Okay, John. John, go ahead. John McKenna.
Yeah, I had a question. I'll just read my question. Does the model result in a unique fracture geometry, or are there other equally likely solutions like there are for observed focal mechanisms where you have two different nodal planes?
The model I had assumed a single fracture plane. I dare say, I mean, yeah, it's you kind of have to assume the number of fractures you're going to have up front in this modeling. I mean, the only possible modeling that you could do where you had no information about any fracture geometry might be something like a phase field situation where you'd have a complete volume and then you'd identify fractures start initiating. But here I'm assuming that there is some sort of fracture initiation and it's going to be in a plane, right? Does that answer your question, John?
Yeah, kind of. Because a lot of times we try to figure out are these fractures vertical or horizontal? Sometimes it can be difficult just to determine that basic simple geometry.
Well, if it's a single fracture and it's vertical or horizontal, then possibly this fracture orientation, the last thing I did where I identified the dip and strike angle by optimization of the tilt. So you basically minimize, those tilt vectors, because the model gives you tilt vectors and you're measuring tilt vectors and you're trying to bring them in alignment, essentially.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everyone. I mean, fascinating conversation, and it looks like we might see a resurgence of an older technology, or that we don't use as much these days. So thank you so much, Anthony.
You're welcome.
And thanks everyone for participating.
Thanks everyone for coming. Yeah.